What's up, everybody? This is MMAsherdog for the Bluff the Spot Plus Lab. Today I'm going to cover check raising. The reason I want to cover this topic is because playing out of position with a capped range is very difficult, and you'll have to mix it up with virtually every hand in your range, which creates a lot of room for error, but of course also a lot of room to gain an edge. So I'm going to review some hand histories at 1-2 and 2-4 no limit sent to me by a student. So let's get started. You can see a 2-4 table right here, 2-4 euros in fact, with our new, shiny, colorful, beautiful Bluff the Spot HUD. Anyway, we have Jack 7 suited in the big blind, and we're most likely going to defend the raise against 2.5x. Jack 7 suited does sometimes get a 3-bet, but most of the time it's just a call. Now, if you believe that, let's say your opponent's open raising far too wide, let's say, or he's far over folding the 3-bets, or maybe he's just too tight, especially in 3-bet pots, then 3-betting more often is absolutely the right play sometimes. But the standard play would be to call. Anyway, we see the Queen 7-4 flop. And as always with check raising, first off, we have to look at our opponent's strategy. So as you can see right here, he's betting less than a third of the pot. And it's reasonable to assume, therefore, that he's c-betting his whole range. So against, let's say 30% pot bet full range, we'll have to end up check raising much more aggressively than if, let's say, he bets like 10 or 15 euros. So we keep that in mind when, picking a combination and perhaps check raising, perhaps not check raising. So we've got Jack 7 suited here. We have second pair, which is an average hand. Generally, when we have an average hand, we just want to check call. But sometimes it's okay to check raise a 7. However, I wouldn't really like check raising this particular hand because the Jack doesn't really help you very much. So let's say we have a hand like 7-5 of hearts. That's a pretty decent check raising hand because not only do we just unblock a lot of air in our opponent's range that's going to be able to win the pot very frequently. So him folding is not even a disaster, even though we had the best hand to begin with if he just bets folds. And we'll also have some really good backdoors, so we can potentially turn our hand into a bluff, or we'll be blocking some really good hands that he may turn on river. So I would like to see our hero check raise here with more like a hand like A7 or 5-7. A hand like Jack 7, let's actually see what happens. He check raises, which I'm okay with at a low frequency. As I said, we have to mix virtually every hand, but this particular hand you won't see getting check raised very frequently. Also, the sizing is a little bit on the large side. I don't mind it. So generally in spots where you check raise quite frequently, you don't need to go huge, right? If you're saying, hey, I got the nuts or I got nothing, you want to go large, right? Let's say in a button big blind spot, if you barrel off with a very polarized range, you also want to use a very large sizing because your value bets are worth a lot of money and your bluffs obviously want to achieve max fold equity. But since right here we're check raising a wide and mergy range, we don't have to go absurdly large. So I would have liked a slightly smaller check raise, but it's by no means a mistake or a serious mistake. Had we gone something like 40, I would have said that's completely unnecessary. Anyway, we do check raise. Okay. So generally what happens is that we check raise quite a bit on the flop, and then on the turn we check quite a bit. It's again similar to button big blind, where we tend to c-bet at a high frequency for a small sizing on a lot of boards, and then on the turn we tend to take it easy. But when we do bet, then it's time to ramp up the aggression and use really, really large bets. So our opponent calls the check raise, and we get a 9 turn. This 9 will add some equity to some of our draws. So let's say a hand like 8-6 of spades was a gut shot and a flush draw before. Now it's an open ender and a flush draw. We may have check raised some kind of hand that now has picked up equity. For instance, a hand like Jack 10 of spades, or maybe even a hand like Jack 10 with 1 spade, or a hand like King 10 with a spade. So this 9 gives us a couple of 9x pairs, and it'll improve our draws a little bit, or it will give our bluff some additional equity. So I would like to see a very large bet if we end up betting. So if we have a hand like Jack 7, for instance, that's just going to be a check. There's no value in betting anymore, or almost no value. It's way more likely we'll get called by a better hand than by worse. And if we were to get raised, that'd be a disaster as well. So I'd like to see our hero check this hand, and obviously be quite tricky, right? Not only check like a 7 or a give up, but also sometimes check with 2 pair or even a set. So it's very important to be tricky when checking out of position. Let's see what our hero does. All right, so he does bet. Yeah, as I said, this is a little bit too thin. We're not really getting much value anymore. I understand that maybe you want to bet just to make him fold, let's say, a decent flush draw, which would be a small victory because that hand has equity and can still bet rivers, and it's going to be difficult to play this hand as a check call. But if you're afraid of check calling a hand like this, that probably means that you're just not checking other hands that can actually fight back. So I'd like to see this hand in our checking range. All right, we had a little bit of value on the flop, but this is a bit too thin. So unless you, let's say, give me a read that our opponent is just a ridiculous fish, he's just calling every hand against every sizing, then that would be okay. But our hero had a full stack. He was betting third pod. He open raised to a funky sizing. It's reasonable to assume that he's just a regular. In which case, even if you think he's maybe really good or not so good, I don't really see a read that would make us want to bet this thinly. Anyway, live and learn. So we end up betting 3/4 pot, which means that our river range is going to be quite wide. I will have to be careful. And this 4, I mean, it reduces the amount of pocket 4s combos we have. It reduces the amount of 7-4 and queen 4 combos we have. So if we had a hand like queen 7, we now lose to a hand like aces or kings. So this card is not so great for us. And obviously, if we did have a draw, and we'll have many of them, they all missed. So this is not a card on which you want to go absolutely crazy. Now, we've got a pair. We unblock all the draws that missed. So now it's time to check and hope we get the showdown, and if he bets, then we'll have to figure it out from there. So we do check, which I definitely agree with. And we face a, pretty large but not absurdly large bet. So I expect our opponent to be betting some sizing like this, maybe even a smaller sizing. And he should definitely also consider an all-in sizing sometimes. So, I mean, is this hand good to call with? Well, we kind of drew ourselves into a corner, right? Because, I mean, we end up with a lot of these average hands if we bet the turn. So let's look at the upsides of our hand. Well, our opponent's bluffs usually contain spades or a 5 or a 6, and we don't hold any of those cards. So that's good for us. It means that we remove hands like, for instance, 8-6 of spades, right? Our opponent's always going to check raise the flop. He's never folding the turn, and on the river he's got 8 high, so it's reasonable to assume that he bluffs that hand. So, okay. Unblocking that hand's great. Unblocking some other random spades and, as I said, not having the 5, 6, or 8 is great. But then again, we block Queen Jack, which is a hand that he'll probably just check behind. And also, we don't have a king and our ace. We don't have a king or an ace in our hand, which also hurts us, right? Because if villain had ace king of spades, he would check back anyway, most likely. But if he had a hand like king queen or ace queen, it's reasonable to assume that he would bet the river. So if we had a hand like, let's say, king 7, that would be a little bit better. All in all, we have an average hand, which, decent blockers. I would say this is probably just a fold. We can still check. We can still have a couple of traps here. We can still check here with hands like queen 7, for instance. We could have check raised and then bet a hand like ace queen, king queen, and then check river sometimes. So I think we'll have better hands to call with. So I think the main problem is the flop and the turn. On the river, it's kind of, it's a shitty spot, and I think it's pretty close. I mean, we need to win. As you see, we're getting 2.39 to 1. So we need to win with this hand at least 30% of the time. Are we going to win? It's probably close, but I would say it's a fold. We do end up calling, which is understandable. Blocking pocket 7s is obviously great because he's going to never play his hand in a different manner. Perhaps he would 3-bet the flop. If he 3-bets at all, maybe he would shove the turn, but it's reasonable to assume that he takes this line with 7s quite often. And villain shows up with ace queen, which is perfectly reasonable, right? And if we count like ace queen off, king queen off, and then queen 7 suited, 7s, 9s, queen 4, perhaps 7-4, 7s, and then a couple other hands, then he's got quite a few value hands right here. So yeah, I think our play was reasonable, but it could have been slightly better. So let's go to the next hand. Okay, so second hand, we see a 3x open raise by under the gun, again playing to €4. And king 10 off is a close hand to defend with. It's normally not that close, but versus a 3x with the, still significant rake, it's not a great call. We do see that Under the Gun does not have a full stack, so I don't know this player, but it's possible that he's a recreational player, which means we can defend slightly more because recreational players tend to open raise too many hands, they tend to be quite passive and, just generally have slightly weaker skills, which means we can mess around a little bit more with a couple of questionable hands. So King 10 is definitely not making you rich here, but I think calling is slightly better than folding. So the idea is that if you fold, you just lose the full big blind, whereas if you call here, you aim to lose less than the big blind. So you will not have an outright win rate with this hand, but you'll lose less than the full big blind. Anyway, topic's check raising, so let's cover that. We see a King 7-4 flop, which is pretty good for imposition. I mean, the King's obviously better because imposition will have aces and kings and ace king, and we won't. Ace king perhaps we can have. We can have hands like King 7 suited, King 4 suited. I don't think our opponent will have them. Perhaps King 7 suited he will have. And then obviously we'll have pocket 4s, pocket 7s. Our opponent will too. And then, just good hands like King, Queen, 9s, etc. Ace, 8 of hearts, that type of stuff. So he's doing pretty well on his board, but we're not doing too badly ourselves. So we see this near half pot bet by a shorter stack. Now, when Under the Gun opens versus Big Blind, this hand is decent on the flop. Whereas if you play this hand button versus Big Blind, now having top pair, decent kicker is much better. So versus Under the Gun, guys, generally you want to play a little bit tighter because our opponent is, let's say, raising 18%, whereas on the button he's opening between 40 and 50%. So we're facing a completely different range. So versus a 40, let's say a 45% range, our hand's looking really good. We have the best hand on the flop probably 85% of the time. Whereas now we probably have the best hand like 60% of the time. Of course, maybe you guys send me a feedback chart and it turns out that I'm a bit off. Obviously, those percentages are guesses, but you get the point, right? Versus Under the Gun, we're not doing nearly as well. So facing this half pot bet, I would say mostly we want to just end up calling. Now, facing this shorter stack, we will be check shoving the turn at a pretty aggressive frequency. Obviously, assuming that the turn is safe, right? If the turn's, let's say, the ace of hearts, check shoving is not much of a thing. So we check raise around 3x, which is understandable. So this is a board where we're both going to miss a decent amount of the time, so we don't need to go huge. Also, you don't want to go huge and then give your opponent extra money when he does shove. And at this stack depth, I would expect people to definitely have some shoves, which Under the Gun does. And this is one of the reasons why check raising this hand is, questionable, because what do you do now, right? We're definitely behind against King Jack, King Queen, Ace King, Aces, but we're ahead against flush draws. Maybe our opponent just overplays a weaker king or pocket tens, let's say, because he just doesn't believe us. So, guys, when you're risking a shove, you generally have to be a bit more careful with your check raises. Because now, what do we do? It's a very tough spot. And it's going to depend a lot on what we think of this villain. The problem is that I see a bunch of zeros. We barely have any hands on this opponent. So even though we've got this pretty HUD up and running, if you have no hands, it's really difficult to make any reads. So it's very close. If we go back to pre-flop, our villain has around 50 big blinds. I would say this is close to a break-even call. I would probably end up calling it off. If we had the King of Hearts, the 10 of hearts, it would be a little bit worse. Now, we would have the backdoor flush draw, which helps, but we would also be blocking some flush draws that end up shoving. Hence, like ace 10 of hearts, we can expect our opponent to be shoving here quite frequently. So I think it's a very close call, but I'm not in love with it. But that's okay, guys. Sometimes you're just in a shitty spot where folding sucks, calling sucks, or on the flop before the raise ends up sucking too. Sometimes you're just in a horrible spot and it's about minimizing damage rather than maximizing on value. Remember, you're in the big blind out of position, so you're not going to get rich in these positions. It's about minimizing your losses, and then when you're in favorable positions, that's when you attack and make a lot of money. So villain does shove, and we call it off reluctantly. And this is exclusive BTS run good. We may not always get it in winning, but in the end, we definitely do win a bit more than we should. So, yeah. I'm kidding, of course. So we see King Queen, which is a reasonable hand to shove with, right? As in, At 50 big blinds, actually, I have to adjust my opinion. Obviously, we would 3-bet ace king every time, whereas at 100 big blinds, perhaps not always. So villain probably doesn't give us ace king, and he knows king queen is the next best thing. He also knows that he doesn't block any flush draw, so he decides to fast play, and we just got lucky. So another reasonable play, but as you can see, as a famous chef called Marco Pierre White once said, perfection is lots of small things done well. So a lot of these things you guys will already know, but it's about sharpening up every little tool in your toolbox, and then you'll create masterful poker, hopefully. So let's do the next hand. On to hand number 3. So we've got King 8 offsuit, and this is actually a heads-up hand, and I wanted to cover a couple of them just because check raising is check raising, and some of you guys like playing heads-up, so I want to cover that as well. I will tell you that I'm not a heads-up specialist. I play mostly 6-max and short-handed, but I think I know what I'm doing heads-up as well. So let's see. King 8 is usually, it's one of those average hands that doesn't perform that well as a 3-bet and is way too strong to fold. So generally when you have an average hand, calling is the play. Now you'll see heads up, if you look at 3-bet charts, you'll see that it mixes almost every single hand, but these types of hands are usually just calls. And we see this 9.6 raise again, so I'd say this is a clear call. Sweet. And we get a king-queen 3 flop. And again, guys, look at what your opponent does. So some villains bet like 20 euros here into a pot of 19. And they'll likely bet, let's say, around half the time. Maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. Some people bet range a third pot. Some people bet range half pot. Our check raise strategy is going to depend heavily on how our opponent plays his c-betting range. So don't start using your RNG, don't start analyzing too much until you've seen your opponent bet. Unless, of course, the board is something like ace deuce, and you know that everybody, nearly everybody range bets that board quite small. Okay, then we can already figure out what's happening. But right here, let's first see what happens. Okay, so we see a similar strategy to the first hand, a slightly under a third pot bet. Okay, so against this strategy, we're going to check raise much more aggressively than against a bet of 20. Against 20, we could probably get away with not check raising at all, or check raising like only a few percent of the time, because obviously this board is quite dry and it's not very good for us, right? We're gonna have hands like, for instance, queen 3 suited, pocket 3s. Some people have king queen, some people don't. You'll have hands like king jack, for instance, sometimes that are also quite good, but there's not an abundance of amazing hands on this board, and there's also no flush draws out there. A lot of the straight draws we have at a discounted frequency. For instance, ace jack we don't have, or at least very infrequently. Hands like jack 10 we don't always have. So all in all, this board is quite good for our opponent, and that's why he gets to see about this board so liberally, is because it's very good for him. So against this small bet size, we can check raise. Let's say an average frequency. King 8 is not really in that range too often. Having an 8 of spades doesn't really help us too much, as in our kicker is average. And generally, you don't want to check raise too much with the average kicker. You tend to want to check raise a bit more with the big kickers, of course, or let's say if you have a hand with very tricky backdoor potential. And this one kind of has none of those. So I, again, don't mind check raising this at a very low frequency. That's something I would do as well, but not at a very high frequency. So this is mostly going to end up being a call. What I do like is the fact that we are check raising aggressively against these small sizes, and we're not just letting our opponent see the turn in the river for a very cheap price. So it's good that we're attacking. On this board, I don't mind if you go with a little bit of a larger sizing, because you're saying, hey, I've basically got something like a very good king or better, and definitely not always. So it's not like you're check raising super thinly. So on this board, I don't mind if you size up a little bit. Okay, check raising a call. And I would like to see our villain, I haven't seen this hand, but I would like to see our villain check on virtually every card. A king or an 8 is maybe a different story, but on virtually every other card, I would like to see our villain check and then try and bluff catch against hands like jack 10, jack 9, etc. So this is what we discussed in the jack 7 hand. On this 5, you're going to have quite a few checks. You're going to have some, let's say, some 5-4 suited type of hands that check raise with backdoors and now just want to get the showdown perhaps. Or you have a hand like this, which is, pretty good in hand strength. I mean, it's good, heads up, but it's not incredible. So right now you have the best hand quite often, but once you start bombing turns and rivers, it's not going to work out very well for you. So we've got a nice hand that we check raise for a bit of value. Now it's time to check the turn and let our opponent bet. And if we have a hand like king 3 suited, let's say, you should check sometimes, right? Let your opponent fire away. So you see high frequency check raise on the flop, on most flops, not this one necessarily. On the turn, we take it easy. So we end up betting here, and as I said, it leaves our checking range very exposed. It means that next time we check, our opponent is going to stab and have a lot of success. It's also going to mean that you're going to end up with a lot of these weaker hands that are in just too big of a pot for their liking. Because, our opponent can easily have, king 9, king 10, king jack, king queen, ace king. Kings, queens, king 3, king 5, queen 3, threes, fives. I probably forgot a couple other ones, but you get the point, right? There's so many hands that we're behind against. And there's also just many hands like, let's say, queen 9 of clubs that we are ahead against, but when we build a pot and it becomes very large by the river, usually when big bets go in, we're on the wrong end of it because he can still improve with all of his draws. So yes, we're technically ahead of them now, but there's a lot of bad cards. Any ace sucks, any jack, any 10, any 9, any club, a queen, right? So there's a lot of scary stuff happening, which means you want to take your foot off the gas and slow play a bit more. Who knows? Maybe this player is really good or really bad, let's say, and you're just trying to take advantage of him, right? Against fish, I generally recommend going a bit more thinly for value because they're very curious and they don't like to fold. But we saw a third pot bet on the flop. That's a reggy move. The deuce doesn't change too much, I guess. Yes, a couple of 2 pairs randomly get there. I guess you could have check raised a hand like 6-4 and, you somehow made the nuts. That's possible, but realistically, it doesn't change a whole lot. I guess if villain range bets, he can have hands as weak as queen deuce offsuit here, maybe queen deuce suited, so not the most relevant card. And now I'd really like to see you check here. We unblock so many air hands like jack 10, jack 9, etc. Those are going to bluff, and this is a sweet hand to check call with, so I'd really like to see you check this one. Yeah, and we end up betting. Again, live and learn, right? If you played perfectly, then there would be no reason to get coached by anybody. But as I said, it hurts your checking range, and now when villain shoves, if he shoves, you're going to be in trouble, right? He, again, has so many better hands. And next time, if I played against you and I would see you check in this spot, I would say, well, our villain has virtually no good hands. I'm just going to stab every single bluff I can find because I know I'm going to have almost 100% success. And our opponent calls and shows up with queen 4. Okay, so can you get called by worse? Evidently you can because our opponent just did. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a great value bet. And as I said, there's also other problems with, what it does to your checking range, what happens when you get raised, etc. So as for our opponent's play, if he bets a queen with no kicker, that indeed shows us that he's likely betting range, because if you had a check back range on this flop, queen 4 suited is just a nice hand to do it with, right? Like an average hand, basically, without real blockers. So, okay, our opponent's betting full range, which means we can be a bit more aggressive. That makes me like the flop play a bit more. Turn and river, still not so much. Anyway, on to the next hand. I'll try and make him as diverse as I possibly can so we see different types of spots. All right, we've got another heads-up hand right here. So we've got 5-6 suited in the big blind, which is sometimes a 3-bet. A lot of people would always 3-bet. It's not necessary to always do it, but it's important to keep up your 3-bet frequency pre-flop so your opponent can't just see a ton of flops for only whatever he raised to. Raised to 10. Before it was 960. I don't think we can get too much of a read on that, but okay. So right here we flop the nuts, which is fantastic. It's always important to keep track of your entire range here. So you have to ask yourself, okay, do I have 5-6 offsuit in my range? And heads up with at 2-4, yes, you do. You have 5-6 offsuit. But then again, your opponent also has 5-6 suited and 5-6 offsuit, right? We're not always going to have 5-6 suited because we're going to sometimes 3-bet. So we're going to have most of the 5-6s. He will obviously have all of them. And then we're going to have 4s, 3s, and 7s quite often, but not always. And he, of course, will as well. Our opponent is also going to miss the flop quite a bit with overcards. So in terms of the nuts, we're kind of even. But then in terms of, weak to average hands, we're doing quite well. When it comes to the slightly better hands, he's doing better because imposition has more overpairs. But we're going to have more just like single pairs, right? Or not by much, but slightly more. Not by much. So, and again, our opponent's strategy is going to dictate what we do here. So I could see villain betting, let's say big or small, right? I would not expect a range bet on this board. Betting range on this board, especially heads up, would be a very significant mistake, especially against our hero, who's been very, very aggressive so far. So even if, let's say, we promise not to check raise, which is a big mistake, guys, we should be check raising. Let's say a check raise frequency is of around 10 to 18% is what I'd recommend. More specifically, around 13 to 15 is something that I would recommend. Now, on a lot of boards in Pi, you'll see that we check raise far more, right? On this board, it really depends on the strategy. So before we start analyzing, let's see what our opponent does. Okay, so we see a 5th pot bet. Okay, so this sizing is very unorthodox. It tells us that our opponent is betting very thinly for value and still therefore quite a wide range, right? So he's basically saying, I see a lot of overcards in your range and you're going to have to fold them despite the small sizing. And I'm just value betting even as thinly as hands like ace high or king high sometimes. So against this strategy, we have to be quite aggressive. Now, had he bet 20, like in the previous hand, he could have, then we would have been more careful. So I'd like to see you check raise this hand virtually always. Now, slow playing sometimes, and let's say check raising the turn of the river is a good play. Obviously, we cannot always check raise every single good hand because then we're kind of face up on the air streets and we'll just get run over by aggression. But in a spot where villain bets 5th pot, the nuts are usually check raised, especially when you have a lot of them, guys. If let's say almost your entire range is quite weak, but a couple of hands are strong, you can be careful with them. So let's say the board is ace, king, deuce, and villain bets like full pot. That's obviously not a spot in which we check raise a lot. You could even get away with not check raising at all. So when you have deuces, check calling sometimes or even always makes sense, right? Because, which other hands are good on ace, king, deuce? King, deuce, maybe, ace, deuce. I guess we'll have some hands like ace, 10 that are pretty good. And that's about it. Maybe we'll have some hands like king, jack that are pretty good, but we don't really have much else. So we could check raise at a very low frequency. Here we should check raise, okay. We check raise to 6x the bet, which is on the big side. I'll probably go slightly smaller, but I don't hate it. It is also a larger bet compared to his bet because he bets so little. Okay. The queen of clubs definitely favors imposition because imposition is going to have more big flushes. So in terms of flushes, we both have quite a few. But if you look at, for instance, hands like ace, jack of clubs, well, we just don't have them because our pre-flop range is quite capped, right? So we still have the straights, we still have some sets, we still have some flushes, we still have some 2 pairs. So it's not as if we should just open fold and go home, but we have to be careful. And I really don't mind this play. Betting 3rd pot when the flush gets there. This is actually a pretty good play. As long as obviously you're consistent and you bet this way if you have, let's say, king 5 of clubs as well. You cannot just pot it with king 5 of clubs, but then bet small when you have something decent, right? Otherwise, you're basically telling your opponent what you've got. Hey, small bet is thin value, and then when you bet big, you just have a really good value bet, right? Obviously, you have to be consistent. So, okay. And 5-6 suited, our hand is definitely worth more than this bet size, but there's still a river to worry about. Okay. Imposition calls. And the river's a 10, which doesn't change a whole lot. Villain could have hands like pocket 10s or maybe hands like 10-7, but not that many other hands, right? So maybe he bet called a hand as thin as ace 10 on the flop and now improves to a pair. Let's say he called with the ace of clubs on the turn. Sure, that's possible, but it doesn't improve him a whole lot. So here we've got a couple of thin value bets on the river. We've also got some really good value bets. So on the river, generally, guys, you want to pick a couple of sizes. You want to go small sometimes for thin value, but also you want to go big, right? Because imposition didn't raise the 3rd pot bet on the turn, so he can definitely have the nuts, but you can expect him to raise some good hands on the turn. So I'd like to see either a small bet or a big bet here. A gigantic bet of, let's say, 200 just doesn't work because imposition has too many flushes. So I wouldn't mind if you ended up betting 3/4 pot, as long as you're consistent, right? So betting both good and bad hands for the same sizing, not just betting small. Let's say betting 40 here with 2 pair, but then next time you got the nuts, you bet big. Be consistent. And also you can still have many bluffs, right? Hands like ace five, for instance, with the ace of clubs you can have, or even hands like 4-5 with the five of clubs you turn it into a bluff. Hands like king five. Mostly we'll end up bluffing here with big clubs. So with the ace of clubs, king of clubs, but not only, right? Imagine if you only bluff with the ace of clubs, then when villain has the ace of clubs, then he should never ever call because he blocks your entire bluffing range. So it's important to diversify your bluffs. 5 deuce is a hand that comes to mind, right? Or even a hand like 6 deuce sometimes. Obviously, we'll only have those suited, right? 6 deuce offsuit is not a defend against 2.5x, even heads up. We bet around 80% pot, a little bit more, and villain calls. So we can expect to have the best hand now 85% of the time. He can definitely call with some weak flushes. And villain has ace queen. Okay, so next point. It's very important to learn from your opponent's bets, right? So we learn from his bets on the flop, but we don't know what he has, so we don't have any reads. Okay, now let's get some reads on our opponent. He's betting ace queen on the flop. So basically saying, hey, I'm going to bet so thinly on the flop that you're forced to call a ton of ace highs. So this was a very, very thin value bet. So against this strategy, if he's betting as thinly as ace high, we have to go crazy check raising. We have to check raise super aggressively. I would assume it's somewhere in the 30s percentage-wise. So we have to check raise extremely aggressively. And then we'll get villain in a lot of trouble because what is he going to do when bet calling this flop? I mean, the queen is one of the best turns in the deck, and he's still hopelessly behind, right? So it kind of shows that imposition strategy doesn't really work. So ace queen with no club especially is mostly just a check back on the flop. He's got a hand which has a lot of showdown value, but in a big pot is not really a hand that can fight, right? Whereas a flush draw is a much easier bet call, even though, let's say we have a jack high flush draw. That hand is worse than ace queen, but it only gets better, right? If you don't improve by the river, you can easily let it go. But if you do improve, you can win a big pot. Whereas ace queen, even on a sweet run out like this, no 4 flush, no 4 straight, the queen and the 10 themselves are not that scary, you're still not happy. So imagine what happens when you get a slightly worse run out, right? You'll end up just folding and folding and folding. So I don't like villains in position bet, and since he's betting so thinly, go after him. And I even made a fist and almost slammed the table, and I said, go after him, and I mean it. Okay, next hand. So again, 2-4, no limit hold'em, 2.5x raise. Okay, so this is a multi-way defense spot. We see that the small blind doesn't have a full stack, and he flatted the small blind, so it's reasonable to assume that this player is not a professional. So we can defend the big blind a little bit wider, looking to play in position against him. You cannot be too much wider because you're still out of position and don't have the initiative against someone who seems to be a good player, but you can play a slightly wider range. Now, deuces is an amazing hand to defend because it's a very easy one to play, right? You flop a set, the pot's going to be very big, and you're usually going to be on the right end of it. If you don't flop anything good, it's easy to just let go. So it's a very easy hand to play. And once again, we see the BTS run good. So as you see right here, right? If I had the flop in, let's say, queen 6-5 and somebody bets, just fold. Yes, you beat hands like 7-8 and king 10 and some flush draws, but your hand is just never going to reach showdown. So let's see what sort does. So sort bets, kind of a funny sizing, a little bit over third pot. And we see Piero call here. And I would like to see you just check raise here. Generally, multi-way, you want to do a decent amount of check raising. This board is not particularly great for you, but it's not that bad either. But what's important here is that Piero's range is quite weak. He's going to call with a lot of middle pairs and ace highs and flush draws and a couple of queens, and occasionally with a better hand. But it's just very important to check raise and get as much money in as you can. I would have liked a slightly smaller check raise than this, but I do like the fact that we check raised. If we're ever going to check raise, deuces and fours are the best hands to do it with. Obviously, we'd never have queens because we'd always squeeze pre-flop. Queen 4 is not only worse because it's 2-pair versus a set, but we block a lot of both their continuing ranges. So Soar is going to bet call a lot of queens here. So having deuces and not blocking a queen that's going to potentially bet call is a big win. And we see imposition shove here. So imposition has to think that we're just isolating the small blind quite a bit for value. So he should not be going crazy here with shoves. So this is a bit surprising. Anyway, I guess we don't have to analyze this hand. It's just an easy call. Okay, so villain has ace 10 of hearts. I'm not a big fan of villain's play, to be honest. Obviously, I do like the pre-flop raise. I don't mind the c-bet at all. So yeah, pretty easy hand to play, but still, it's important to, check raise a little bit more value heavy versus a potentially weaker player, right? Because, I mean, weaker players tend to not fold too much. So let's say check raising here with the 8-6 spades looking to pull a big bluff, especially against a short stack, that's not going to be a recipe for success. So be careful with those types of moves. Against recreational players, generally just keep it simple. Don't use all kinds of moves they have no idea about. You'll just end up outplaying yourself. So keep it simple and only make things complicated when it actually helps you. Making things more complicated for no reason, I mean, there's no point to it. Anyway, let's do one more hand. Last hand of this video. Again, it's heads up, which is not really that important. We are over 200 big blinds deep, which changes the pre-flop dynamic a little bit. King 6 offsuit, especially against a min raise, is a call. You can also sometimes 3-bet if you like, but call is definitely the most frequent play. Okay, so we end up calling. And once again, we're going to have to look at villain strategy. Some people bet range third pot or smaller. Maybe it goes half pot. Maybe it goes even larger. So villain bets 5 euros in a little bit. So when he bets, 5 and 8, what is that? 62.5% pot. We can assume that he's not betting his full range. If you were betting his full range, you can definitely not use this sizing. So we assume that he's likely betting somewhere between 50 and 80% of the time. Maybe like 40 and 80% of the time, which means we slow down our check raises a little bit. Now, with King 6, we have top pair, which is great for check raising. We have a 6, which is a mediocre kicker at best. The good thing here is that we have the 6, which makes a straight on some runouts, or at least blocks a straight on some runouts. So that's a good thing. We ideally also want to have a club in our hand, which means we can, turn our hand to a bluff sometimes, or bluff catch our hand a bit more easily. So with King 6 specifically, again, occasionally check raising works well with the intention of then checking the turn. But most of the time, we want to end up just check calling. So if we had a hand like, let's say, King 6 of hearts with the backdoor flush draw, we'd be check raising our hand significantly more frequently than without the backdoor flush draw. If we had the 6 of clubs, we would check raise more frequently than without the 6 of clubs. Now, does it make a world of difference? No. But if, as I said before, perfection is lots of small things done well. If you have tons and tons of small edges, they amount to a big edge in the long run, right? There's not that many adjustments you can make that will just make you play well when before you were playing poorly, right? There's a lot of small things that all have to be sharpened up. So we check raise. Okay, I don't mind the sizing necessarily. Would have maybe gone even a tiny bit smaller, but it's fine. And we absolutely have to check the turn. This is a hand which is good a lot on the flop, but again, we're going to be in trouble on later streets. So I'd really like to see a check on the turn. Now, of course, that does mean that the turn doesn't improve us, right? If the turn's a 6, most of the time you want to end up just betting. And we see the ace, and here this is just a mandatory check. The ace is not a good card for our range, so it is important to sometimes check raise ace high, right? I said diversify your check raises. So let's say we check raise a hand like ace 7 sometimes, or a hand like ace 5, or even a hand like ace of clubs 6, let's say, check raising to potentially bluff off. And we're going to have to check a lot here. We don't have ace king, we don't have aces, we don't have kings. We have a limited amount of hands like ace 7, for instance. So checking often. And this is kind of where the previous plays hurt you a little bit, right? The fact, this is an easy check. It's a good check. It's absolutely the best play. But it's important that you also check good hands, like much better hands, so that our opponent doesn't just go like 65 on the turn, all in on the river, and then we're just in no man's land not knowing what to do. So checking this turn at a very, very high frequency. Some people even decide to check their full range, which is, very passive, but it would be an understandable play. I don't think we need to check our whole range on this board. That's on this turn. That's a bit too passive, but I'd rather check my whole range than bet my whole range. So villain bets 2/3 pot. Not a sizing I am in love with, but okay. And I would say with this hand, you probably you probably want to end up just check calling. We can still fold hands like Jack 10 that didn't improve, just gave up. We can still fold some weak flush draws that we gave up with, or some hands like 9-8, for instance, or, you know, maybe even just a 5. But having a king here with no club blockers, I think this hand should just be a call. Now, that doesn't mean that we're committing to putting all the money in, but against this 2/3 pot bet size, I think we should just call. Turns a 3, and this is where the 6 helps you, right? Because now we do block 6-4, which is a hand you can expect our opponent to play in this manner sometimes. So that's one of the benefits of having that backdoor. And villain bets 70 into 106, so around 2/3 pot again. And now, I mean, we have second pair, which is decent. We have no clubs in our hand, which is fantastic, obviously, and we don't block any of the obvious bluffs. His obvious bluffs will be Queen Jack, Jack 10, 9-8, 8, 8-6, let's say. Okay, we do block 8-6, but we also block 6-4. So if you believe that your opponent is a competent player, this hand, I believe, will be check called. I'm talking about a lot about bluff catching right now. You can see that in other videos that we'll be uploading very shortly. Maybe you've already watched that video and are now watching this one. So let's see. We do call, okay. And villain has Jack 6 of clubs. So I don't mind his play, but I don't like the bet sizes too much. If our opponent applies more pressure to us, it's going to be much more difficult for us to call down. I mean, he does have 5s and 7s and 6-4 and ace-king and kings and aces and, king 5 and ace-7, etc. He has so many good hands. Having the clubs, of course, is not great. But I think our play is pretty solid. So overall, let's recap this. Judging from only a few hands, of course, it's difficult to say what your check raise game looks like. You're doing a good job check raising frequently against small and depolarized bets. But then obviously, this is a check raising flop video, but obviously we have to think about how that impacts the hand, right? You can check raise a perfect range on the flop, but if you have no idea how to play it on later streets, you're going to be in trouble regardless. So I'd rather have you slightly under check raise the flop, but then play well post flop, play well on the turn the river, rather than check raise perfectly on the flop, let's say, and make a tiny bit more money, but then you're lost on the later streets because your range is just too wide, and you don't really know what to do with it. And that's why I cover this spot so often, because it's a very, very difficult one to figure out. And a lot of imposition c-bet spots, if you bet range 1/3, it's not necessarily the best play, but it's definitely a good play, right? It's much easier. Whereas being out of position with a capped range, you have to mix your strategy, and it's going to result in more mistakes. So overall, I think you're doing a good job, as I said, of check raising against thin and depolarized bets. But then you're kind of overplaying your hand on turn and river, and when the pot's very big, you're often losing it. So I would bet if you look at a ton of hands in your database, when the pot's very large, you tend to lose a lot of them. But when the pot's quite small, you tend to probably win a lot of them. And obviously you want to ideally do the opposite, right? You want to minimize your losses in the small ones. Obviously win as many as you can, but especially win the big ones. So, and I think now so you may be winning a lot of pots. Your one with a flop may be very high, and that's winning a lot of winning when having seen the flop is good. But if you look at the biggest pots, you're probably on the wrong end of them sometimes, because you're overplaying turns and rivers. And it also means that when you take a passive line and check, which we didn't see very often, you're probably going to be run over a little bit while facing pressure. So mixing it up a little bit more, not always taking the straightforward line, is the way to go. So overall, I think the hands were all played pretty well. But as I said, there is a couple of things that could be improved for sure. So I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. I tried to be as critical as I could be while being fair, to our Bluff the Spot student. Obviously, I'm not going to kiss his ass just to make everybody look good. So we're all trying to learn here. So I appreciate you watching the video, and I can't wait for you to watch the next video. So good luck at the tables, and I'll see you guys soon. This was MMAsherdog for the Bluff the Spot Plus Lab. See you around, guys.